do a hard stop here at 2:15. My name is Emily Benson. I'm an associate fellow working for the Schulter in International Business at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, just a kilometer the other side of downtown. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Steve and Azelle for organizing and convening everyone from around the world. It's a pleasure to see everyone from GTIPA. My last conference was the one in Mexico City. So it's wonderful to see familiar faces, especially after the last couple of years. Today we'll have sort of a casual fireside discussion about the topic that everyone is hearing about constantly in the news, which is supply chains. I think it's we're all experiencing some level of vindication because for people like us, it's always been about supply chains to a degree. So it's been sort of gratifying to see supply chains receive the attention that they have been in the last year, especially the last 6 months. On a more granular level, I think we have some of the kind of most popular topics in supply chains represented on this panel here. Those are semiconductors, obviously, medical equipment and COVID-related supply chains, and then the other big buzzword of the year, which is sustainability. So I look forward to having a good discussion with our panelists, and I will go ahead and introduce them now before going into a few questions. So here we have Chris Kane. He is the president of the Center for Global Enterprise based in New York. Next to him, John Neufert is the president and CEO of the Semiconductor Industry Association based here. Hubertus Bart joins us from Germany. He's the director and head of research at the German Economic Institute. And Pietro Paganini is the co-founder, and I love this, Curiosity Officer at Contere in Italy. So thank you all for joining us. Today, we'll start with a question for Chris and then proceed with the rest of the panelists. If you could all answer, chip in your thoughts. The first question is, how are companies responding to supply chain disruptions? How are they making decisions? How are these affecting firms and ultimately consumers? We at CSIS recently put forward a report which unsurprisingly found that at the end of the day, companies really care about one thing, which is maintaining the autonomy to make decisions about where to base their supply chain. So they really want control at the end of the day. But in other words, they don't want to be told you must reshore or you must rethink in this particular manner. What that means, I think, is that companies are indeed rethinking supply chains, but maybe not in a completely uniform way. So I look forward to hearing what you've witnessed in your research.
Okay, great, thanks. It's nice to be here. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, GTIPA, for convening. It's really fun to see an organization grow and mature like this has over the last number of years, and it's all due to the people's commitment, the association's commitments. So, Emily, you're right. There's a lot of rethink and reflection going on now among companies. We, at the Center for Global Enterprise, convene companies from all around the world in a number of different areas. Supply chain transformation was our first institute that we established. And it might be helpful for me just to talk about how companies are actually refocusing and reinvesting their resources as well as their expertise to deal with the supply chain realities we've got. There are 5 areas of focus and investment that we're seeing from companies. The first is dynamic resilience, and we heard Matt talk this morning about resilience. I'm going to draw a distinction between what he said and what we see in the marketplace among companies. But the reason I call it dynamic resilience is because companies are realizing that there's so much change going on in the world that it's not sufficient to establish a supply chain organization that is hardened and resilient at one moment in time and then rigid and breakable at the next moment in time. And so how are they doing that? They're doing that with AI tools and machine learning tools. So dynamic resilience is the first area of focus and investment that we see. Second is around visibility. Companies have always wanted to have, but have been incapable of having end-to-end visibility of their supply chain, from the order to the fulfillment back to the consumer. And in this area, companies are looking at and starting to deploy digitalization tools and processes, which is probably the most important thing to think about. This is not just about technology and tools. This is about management processes and transformation. And the second is blockchain. It gives to a certain degree, it gives a really good visibility to a supply chain owner. The third is security. So 1, dynamic resilience, 2, visibility, 3, security. In this case, there is a huge push by companies right now to extend their security perimeter and make their suppliers and their supply chain much more cyber ready. And therefore, large supply chain owners like Colgate-Palmolive, like Apple, like General Motors are saying, we now have no choice. We've always had the desire, but we now have no choice but to make our suppliers, our small and medium enterprises, cyber ready. And so they're spending a lot of time with that. And we have projects going on with Apple and General Motors and DoD agents that are preparing companies, small and medium companies, for DoD qualifications. The fourth is talent. There's a lot of focus and a lot of energy going by companies going into supply chain talent because, one, it's not the great resignation, it's the skills that are needed for a digital supply chain, a transformed supply chain, don't exist in supply chain organizations. So the talent issue is both a skills issue and a supply issue. And we're spending a lot of time with companies on that. In particular, women. Companies don't have enough women in their supply chain organizations, and they have failed at making supply chain a profession, a desirous profession. So the opportunities in supply chain, now that it's cool, right? Now that people are actually thinking about it and talking about it, the opportunities in supply chain for women are exploding, but the skill set needs to be worked on at the company level. And the last is what we call the new customer. Customers have changed and supply chains have not. All right, and this is both a B2B, business to business statement, as well as a business to consumer statement. And what companies are doing is that, one, they're having to figure out and understand this new customer, and then they have to figure out how to please it. And their processes, which have been built and evolved over a number of decades, are not adaptable enough yet to be able to be responsive and pleasing to the new customer. So those are the 5 areas that we see getting a lot of focus and a lot of investment.
Great. Thank you for that. John, would you like to chime in?
First of all, I've never heard anyone say supply chain work is cool, but we're almost there, Chris. Secondly, thanks, Stephen, for inviting me. This is one of the rare opportunities the last 2 years I've been able to wear a necktie, and I see now I actually didn't have to do it. So. But so just a few things. The chip industry has been wildly successful for a couple of key reasons. One is our breathtaking pace of innovation. This thing called Moore's Law, where you double the number of transistors on a chip every two years or so. And today now we can put about 54 billion on-off switches, which are transistors, on a chip about that size. 54 billion, which is pretty awesome. We're manipulating materials at atomic levels to do that. But the other thing is supply chains. These sophisticated supply chains that we've developed over the last 40 or 50 years have allowed us to take advantage of markets around the world and become amazingly efficient. And we've developed this crazily efficient, well-oiled machine that allows us to grow and innovate. We have the Japanese that are great at tool making. Japanese also are great at making the ingots where you slice the wafers. The Koreans are great at memory. We're great at design and manufacturing. The Taiwanese are fantastic at manufacturing. So because of these basically centers of excellence around the world, we've become an incredibly successful industry. But we found with the pandemic that there's some obvious vulnerabilities, and some of those vulnerabilities have been thrown into bold relief. And one lesson we've learned is that while we have built our supply chains to be biased towards efficiency, there's some shortcomings with that. We've fine-tuned just-in-time delivery approaches, and we found that, well, inventories in crises matter. So you have to also build in just-in-case approaches to supply chain management. And that's a very important lesson for us, but I think for other big industries, particularly auto industry. And for us, what's in particular a vulnerability that's emerged is that we don't manufacture enough chips here in the U.S. In 1990, we manufactured about 37% of the world's chips. Now we manufacture about 12%. Second piece of it is the most innovative chips, those sub 10 nanometer, those chips are all produced overseas. They're not produced here anymore. We don't have the capability here. 92% of them are produced in Taiwan, and 8% of them are produced in South Korea. So we are now trying to rebalance our supply chains to get, and I think a lot of other industries are doing the same thing for different reasons, to address some of these vulnerabilities. But what I'm not talking about is reshoring all of our capabilities. What I'm talking about is we're going to be building, our industry is going to be building literally hundreds of new fabs in the next 10 years. There's an explosion of demand for chips for obvious reasons: AI, quantum computing, IoT, and we don't have enough fabs, place where you build the chips, to meet that demand. So as these new fabs are being built, we want more of them built here in the U.S. The problem is that other governments around the world offer massive incentives to attract fab construction. Our government has not been in that business. And there's this legislation out there with a $52 billion price tag on it, which is a good start, which would incentivize manufacturing here in the U.S. with grants. There's also an investment tax credit. If you build fabs or improve fabs, you get a tax credit. This is a good start to level the playing field and to help us rejigger our supply chains. And basically, it's the underlying approach is to diversify risk, so that we don't have 75% of semiconductor manufacturing happening in East Asia anymore. More of it should be happening here and in Europe and other places around the world, so we can spread the risk out. Thanks, Ellen.
Great, thank you. Hubertus, would you like to chime in from the European perspective?
Yeah, thank you very much. And again, thanks for organizing that and hosting us here. I think if I look at the European discussion, and I would not be surprised if it would be very different here, is that many very different things are mixed together and discussed under the headline supply chain issues or supply chain problems. So, for example, there's been a timber shortage for a certain period of time, which affected the construction industry. And one of the reasons for timber shortage was the US suddenly, because of wildfires, became an importer and always has been an exporter of timber. So that has nothing to do with the COVID situation and nothing to do what just has been described in the semiconductor in the industry. So these kind of short-term market tensions, they always happen here and there. There are always scarcities in specific markets, and always reactions necessary. Let's remember the 2011 Fukushima event, so the flooding and the earthquake, the tsunami in northern Japan, and there again, value chains or supply chains had to be reorganized pretty quickly, because there were certain industries that only existed over there, and very quickly production, for example, could have been added in North America. And the only thing which was missing for a certain period of time was, I think it was a blue color for cars. So that was the only thing where adaptation to that new situation wasn't possible. And so these kind of things always happen, which also means that there's a certain resilience of the supply chains and resilience of the industries. And what we've seen last year was that the COVID shock hit worldwide, and production worldwide and logistics worldwide was affected more or less at the same time. And compared to that situation, or looking at that situation, we can be surprised or happy that the effects haven't been much more severe and much more problematic. And but coming back to the different things in that box. There are still COVID-related production problems. So sneaker industry says that there are missing of culture produced in the Philippines because of COVID, or there's some mining which still isn't working, and that will always, or that will be from time to time that industry take quite a lot of time. What we also see is a huge logistics problem. It's like an echo effect of that sharp breakdown in early 2020 and the rapid recovery, and the expectations which have been fundamentally wrong during the downturn. Many companies, at least in Germany, believed there will be a long period of recession, so they stopped orders. Logistics stopped from Asia to Europe, not because it wasn't possible to ship things, but because the demand wasn't there. And then suddenly, after 2 or 3 months, everyone realized, well, that recovery will be quicker and sharper than expected. And then they started reordering additionally because demand increased in certain industries. And that's what we still see. The process of bringing all the things in that case from Asia to Europe, and that's like a traffic jam in the holiday seasons when everyone comes at the same time, and that also will take a time to be sorted out. Then, which is from the German perspective, at least, the most critical of the current supply chain problems is supply of semiconductors. Critical because it affects the automotive industry, and that's for Germany at least a big lever of the economy. And car production in Germany is in 2021 almost 20% lower than in 2020. And 2020 was a COVID year, so that was 25% below 2019. So that's and the latest development that's not because of COVID, that's because of semiconductors. My fear is that as demand has risen sharply and maybe quicker than expected as well, that will take a while to rebalance that, and it will take a while for the automotive industry to be next in line to be supplied. So, and then what we have discussed earlier today was not that much maybe the short-term effects, but then we come to political risk within the supply chains. And we have been discussing that for, 15 years now, that rare earth elements more or less completely come from China, and that can be used as a political lever, or and these kind of political risks are much more difficult for companies to cope with. Normally we say, well, you have on a company level, and that was also part of the paper we've written, it should be a decision, first round, a decision on the company level, which costs are we willing to pay for the additional security of supply. Stockpiling costs money, diversification of suppliers is expensive, and in many cases not possible, by the way, because there are so many things where very specialized products or components or qualifications are needed that you can't choose among many on the world markets, and that's the reason why it's so difficult to have such a standard political reaction on that. So in the last thing, and I'll finish with that, is that all is mixed with transition period where many of the global value chains, global supply chains have to be rebuilt for completely different reasons. So automotive industry suddenly depends on batteries and the elements or the natural resources needed for that. So that means policymakers in the US, but the concepts of the European Commission are quite similar in the analysis. That includes semiconductors, artificial intelligence technologies or qualifications, and then it's about then it's not that much about security of value chains. It's about future value added within the country. So then it's more industrial policy than it is has too much to do with the current COVID ignited related supply chains risks and problems we have.
Thank you, Hubertus. Pietro, what are you seeing in Italy?
Well, being the fourth one, basically everything was already said, so I cannot add much more. I can be quiet. Take the next question. No, I agree with everything that was said, except that I would instead enjoy more talking about how some supply chain worked during the pandemic. So if you think that for 2 years, every day during the lockdowns, and in Italy we had strong lockdown, I went to the store and my Nutella was there. And now you say Nutella is a typical Italian product, but it's a global product. And it's a product that is done by cocoa. Cocoa is not produced in Italy, it's not produced in Europe. It comes from South America, it comes from Latin, some from Asia. It's done from sugar. It's done with oil palm. It's done with other fats. Nothing that comes from Italy. But still, it was on the shelf every day. So that was the case of a supply chain that functioned despite, what is happening all around the world. And I would say that we were lucky all around the world because most of us, I guess, got our food. So it's a good example of how supply chain have worked. And they are global supply chains. And the question was during the pandemic, should we go back to national supply chains and should we forget about the global supply chains? The reality is, and I say this for the younger people here, that the purpose of the supply chain is to increase profits, basically, or how you develop the supply chain is to increase profits and to deliver better products or better services. We understood one thing, and that was right, that probably we need to understand better the vulnerabilities that was said earlier that you might have along the supply chain. So what might go wrong at a certain point? We live in a sort of dream world that everything could work sharply, and it's a matter of slow changes. And with the vulnerabilities, we understand something could go wrong. So I like very much the expression that was made earlier about, and I will definitely use it in the future, just in case something happens. And that means that you have to map your supply chain, and probably you have to diversify your supply chain. Right? Thinking about what could go wrong and thinking about how you can replace what could go wrong. But I agree with Hubertus when he said diversifying is complicated and it takes time and it could be more expensive. And this is the first part that basically repeats what was already said. But there is a second element because you mentioned what we're doing with supply chains. The question is how policy will impact on supply chains. And this morning I made a provocative question to our keynote speaker that we got this morning about sustainability. You guys talk a lot about resilience, but you don't talk about sustainability. And what Europe is doing is fostering and pushing policies that favor sustainability. That is not just CO2 reduction. Sustainability means environmental sustainability, zero deforestation, for instance, protection of biodiversity, for instance, labor rights, human rights. That means along the supply chain, with new EU regulation that are being developed, you have to ensure that all the parts along the supply chains are sustainable. And that is a gigantic challenge for supply chains, and that would be a gigantic cost for supply chain, because you have to put together two parts. On one side, producers, and as we said, and as we know, the producer on the supply chains, the very beginning of the supply chain is usually a small producer. In agriculture, you call it a smallholder. That usually is a farm family. And you have to tell that farm family that you have to be sustainable. So you need to provide resources. It's a cultural issue. Don't cut trees. It's a cost for a family, not cutting trees. So you have to provide resources. And then along the supply chain that has to be monitored, and you can use technology for monitoring that. You have to get to the final one, that is us, the customer. And how you answer the customer? More prices. The risk is to increase prices of products. So all this sustainability along the supply chain means that somebody has to pay for it. Would be the companies, the many players along the supply chain, or the final user, us. And I think that is a question that we should discuss, because if Europe, the US, or other countries are going to implement these policies, there will be a cost. And we have to be ready to discuss who's going to pay for this cost along the supply chain.
May I just add one thing, because that's an interesting point you mentioned, that the discussion about sustainability in supply chains or supply chain responsibility, which is not only a European one, but one of the things many NGOs, for example, ask companies to do is, if they don't comply to the standards, then delist them. And delisting someone, that's exactly the opposite of diversification of supply chains. So we have two political demands. One is reduce the supply chains to those who are really sustainable, and the other one is increase the number of suppliers in order to increase security of supply.
Well, thank you all for that. I think, as John said, supply chains are almost cool. If we reference the Nutella example a little more, maybe we'll hit our peak. Supply chains are cool. I think that's a very good example of why globalization is so beneficial. Let's go back to semiconductors for just a couple of questions. Semiconductor, the industry has historically been a major beneficiary of global value chains, globalization. As you mentioned, in Congress right now, there's a proposal to spend $52 billion on the CHIPS Act. You also said that you're not particularly interested in onshoring and reshoring. So how does the industry reconcile this kind of need and dependency on global value chains with this increased demand for domestic financing to ramp up fabs here? And one additional question, I think we can kind of characterize in a certain way the Biden administration policy towards semiconductors as helping American industry run faster in this technology race. I think there's another competing side of people who would argue that it's better in a technology race to try and trip the other guy. So do you think that that's a fair assessment of the Biden strategy? We're trying to help American producers run faster. Is that the right approach? Or is it better to run faster and try to trip the other guy?
Yeah, I'm going to answer that last one partially. But on the first one, I think what you're getting at is the dynamic between the pressure now to have localization of supply chains versus turning that into some kind of protectionist policy. And it's frankly a balance. I think that in the case of the U.S. semiconductor industry, we're kind of in the wrong place. Other countries decades ago made the strategic choice to provide manufacturing incentives for their chip industries, and we have not. As a result, we've seen a very significant erosion over the years of our ability to manufacture. And now, as I mentioned, we have some innovation problems as well. Our government funding for basic science and also semiconductors has been flat for decades. While other governments around the world, it's not been that way. It's been very significant ramp-ups. So what we're trying to do for our industry is level the playing field. It's not protectionist. It's just putting us in the same space as everybody else. But I totally agree with you that there will be temptations to turn some of this supply chain resiliency stuff into protectionist policy, and I think that's highly risky. As far as the Biden administration's policies here, we're very happy of a strong pivot towards an affirmative agenda. In our sector, we see it with the CHIPS legislation coming out of Congress and very strongly supported by the Biden administration, which includes funding for research and funding for chip manufacturing here. we've been with the pendulum had swung too far to the defensive side of things, as you call the tripping side of things, and now it's swung more to a balanced. You have to have a defensive agenda to take care of your national security interests and things like that, but you also have to have an affirmative agenda, and we were coming up short, and now I think the Biden administration very much has embraced that, and so has Congress.
Yeah, great. Thanks. So maybe we're in the race and we're catching up, but not quite there just yet. Hubertus, let's turn to you. You were instrumental this year in leading a GTIPA effort to write a monograph entitled "Global Value Chains After the COVID-19 Crisis," which is available just back here. Encourage all of you to read it. It's short and understandable, which I think can be rare in the trade and supply chains world. Hubertus, could you walk us through some of your main takeaways from that publication and what you learned and any advice you could impart to the rest of us?
Yeah, thank you. We've written that last year in the situation where we observed strong political reactions on, well, first of all, question of supplies of medical products, and where many countries reacted by stopping exports and promoting imports. So a bit like reverse mercantilism, where normally exports are promoted and imports are not. But anyways, what we feared was that global supply and global division of labor was mainly seen as a risk, and we wanted to point out that it's one of the core fundamentals of our prosperity. And starting with that sentence earlier today, that not every country can produce everything, and that isn't, which doesn't make any sense. From the German perspective, for example, there are many medium-sized, family-owned, traditional companies focusing on very tiny, very specific things. I couldn't explain what. I'm not a technician, but very specific things, and they always tell me why that's so fantastic and needed for other things. And but what they need to do it to be successful is they need to be highly specialized, and they only can be highly specialized in their niche if they have the world market. So reducing the world market to European market, for example, because Europe should produce it for itself, and North America and Asia should produce it for itself, would reduce the ability to accumulate know-how and therefore also be an obstacle for innovation. So we wanted to point out that that supply chains are or that global supply chains are not only a risk but very, very valuable, and we wanted to discuss what's part of the political answer and what's the role of private businesses. And I mean, there are many options that a company can do to mitigate risks. They can, I mentioned stockpiling, they can diversify suppliers, they can just try to have better contracts, long-term contracts than others. They can buy a company, a core supplier, which is something discussed in the automotive industry. Should we buy shares or buy lithium company somewhere in order to secure that trade flow. And but that's a decision on the company level, and it can also be a decision to say, but the probability that this will happen again is so small that we don't need an insurance against that risk. Costs may be high, but probability is low, and then it may be more important, and that's also part of resilience, not only to mitigate risk, but to be able to recover quickly. So I know if suddenly there's a blackout, and then for many companies the question is not how to stop production, but the question is how quickly can you restart. And so that was basically what we tried to do in that paper.
Okay, let's turn now to Pietro. Do a lot of work on sustainability During the pandemic, in the first couple of months, there were some political changes, obviously, that occurred in the United States, and there was sort of a renewed optimism about the role that sustainability would play in a lot of public dialogues, both from participants in democracy and leadership itself. What have you seen during the pandemic with regards to sustainability? Furthermore, what have you witnessed in the transatlantic relationship? How can Europe and the United States play a more cohesive role in developing sustainability within supply chains? Sustainability in both of the senses.
Yeah, that's a very smart question. First of all, I was surprised because in Europe, sustainability is like a buzzword. Everybody says sustainability now. Everything you do is sustainable. Okay, you go to the bathroom, has to be sustainable. Everything's sustainable. I come to the U.S. in resilience. Okay, and I haven't heard anybody say sustainability, including the beans you have out there where there is everything in there. So you should be able to recycle that for the next time we come here from Europe. Paper, plastic, trash, just for us. You can keep using your diesel, but for us, you have to do that. But aside of joking, what is very interesting, and as I said, and I'm very, as a European, I should speak as an Italian, but I say as a European, I'm very proud of the attempt that Europe is taking in fighting the speed of climate change. Okay, I said the speed of climate. I didn't say climate change. The speed of climate change. And I'm very proud of the incredible work the European Commission and the Parliament are doing on several legislative process that they go under the name, for instance, of the Farm to Fork. And in the Farm to Fork, you have new regulation project. And the way the European Commission and the Parliament, the European legislative process works is very complicated. Needs probably to be refreshed. But certainly what's happening right now, it's important. There is what is called a new diligence directive or regulation that basically is including for for some commodities that are entering Europe to follow specifically a very strict regulation. And this is now regarding few food products, but will be expanded to all food products and all commodities and every component entering Europe. Anything will have to be somehow certified. And this goes down, for instance, to specifically saying where a certain commodity comes from geographically, so that when I today buy Nutella, I go with my jar of Nutella to the Nutella store and say, where is this coming from? They can tell me exactly where any of these ingredients are coming from. Exactly means who is working on that, and that will be applied to all products coming into Europe, including now it's being introduced a scorecard system saying this is what the Commission is thinking. To me, is about a bit crazy, but it is countries will be divided based on the level of sustainability of their supply chains. That means there will be red countries where there is a high level of deforestation, there is a yellow, green, and so on. And this is also a form of discrimination in a way, because you say, oh, I'm buying, let's say, sugar cane coming from Indonesia, red country. I'm buying this coming from, where was Honduras? Since we have a friend from Honduras, lobbies for sugar cane. We buy this green. This is a form of discrimination in a way, because it's based on criteria that are European criteria, not Americans. So it would be nice now to understand where America stands on this. And I know that some American policymakers are a bit concerned, saying, well, this is a discrimination. This is, in a way, a form of protectionism as well. The other aspect is that this is a European legislation or regulation, as you want to call it, that is affecting producing countries around the world, but is not engaging producing countries around the world in this legislative process. I think that when you develop a legislation that is so important, you need more stakeholders to be engaged. Because otherwise, if I'm a farmer in the middle of Malaysia or the Philippines, I would be a bit concerned about this legislation that is going to affect me. Basically, Europe tells me, could be seen as a colonialist approach, tells me how to be sustainable and what I have to do in order to enter that. There is another element in this, since your question is about sustainability. If Europe puts these rules, but nobody else does it, then nobody probably will export toward Europe, or only few will export toward Europe, and all the rest will export to other countries. Just to mention one, China, where the rules on sustainability, for instance, are much lower. Okay, and this will not contribute to the battle of the climate change discussion. So my final point here is what Europe is doing is great, but it's doing it on its own. And I think that the US should be engaged in this, and probably the world community should have this discussion. So when we think about the sustainability of supply chains, since supply chains are global, the discussion should be global. Then you will tell me, Emily, and the question would be, can we get to a global discussion or global agreements? Probably the answer is, it will take time, long time. Do we have that time? Probably not, I don't know. But I think that the discussion should be at the global level. So the fact that today we're talking about it as the global alliance is a good starting point, but we're not making the rules. We're suggesting the policy perhaps. But it has to be a global discussion.
Well, I want to be conscious of time, but just one quick follow-up is that our United States Secretary of Agriculture recently, Tom Vilsack, launched a platform with the European Union to track or more closely collaborate, which probably means to send a few more emails this year on sustainable agriculture. So do you think, can we expect any tangible results from that or not, given the kind of the relationship that we've had over agriculture in the past?
Look, I don't know what is the background of this, but I can tell you that it's a certainly good starting point on agriculture. But what I heard already is that both parts were in disagreement in the sense that this platform should be, we share information, we work together in order to use fertilizers better, techniques, use of digital technology, precision agriculture, and so on. But on the other side, Europe said, okay, these are the rules. And the US said, these are, let's say, rules that we cannot accept. And the answer from the US was as well, if you put this rule, this is protectionism. So when we think about working together as well on sustainability, for instance, and in agriculture, the question also should be, the rules are done to really foster sustainability or they're done to protect certain interests or national interest. I've been working extensively in Europe on certain commodities, and clearly the bottom line is, the goal is sustainability, but the bottom line is defending French, when I say that, German, and other English, there is an English somewhere, England now is out, farmers. So the question is that really pushing for sustainability or is pushing to defending certain national interests? And this is another matter that has, in a way, to be challenged.
Thanks. I think we'll come back to the question in a little bit about sustainability versus protectionism, which I know is ever-present topic in transatlantic relations these days. But first, I'd like to go back to Chris. You guys have done a lot of work on how companies are handling supply chain crunches, including the use of technology, which you referenced earlier. Could you explain in a little more detail how companies are leveraging new technology, whether it's blockchain, artificial intelligence, to combat these supply chain issues? I think one kind of tangential but interesting point is that one of the major ports here in Virginia actually is experiencing relatively little backups compared to other ports, and it's come out recently that they have a relatively high degree of having integrated artificial intelligence into their port operations, which to me points to the fact that maybe a broader adoption of some of these tools could be quite helpful. So look forward to your thoughts.
Sure. So a lot of the discussion around sustainability that Pietro was just talking about really boils down to visibility. How do I know, where things come from, and do I care, right? And companies are deploying technologies and changing their processes to enhance and expand their visibility in real time. And that's where artificial intelligence and machine learning comes in, which is what data is it giving me that's usable quickly that I can apply to my supply chain values and objectives. So I think there has been a lot of talk about blockchain, and we have done a lot of work about blockchain and its usability in different areas of supply chain. And And here's the current state of play with blockchain. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, it was the hottest thing you could read about. It was going to be the silver bullet. It was going to solve all the problems of visibility. Not the case, for two reasons. One, has limited use, and it cannot be the overall solution, but it can be a component to a solution. So it can be a mechanism by which you increase visibility into one aspect of a commercial or an economic relationship. The second reason it's difficult, and it is still struggling, although we will see blockchain's relevance grow. We will see it deployed more extensively. Well, the biggest barrier is small and medium enterprise adoption. If I'm the owner of a supply chain and I have 10,000 suppliers, the ability for me to use and deploy blockchain is one thing. The ability for my suppliers to adopt and deploy blockchain is an entirely different story. It is a huge barrier. So even the most leading edge supply chain owners who are deploying technologies such as blockchain to increase visibility, to be able to have an accurate profile of their sustainable behavior, cannot get the supplier community to adopt it because more often than not, their IT infrastructure and their skill set is very immature.
All right, let's do one more question and then we'll turn to the audience. This one is for John or anyone else who might want to answer, but in September, the European Union met with the United States in Pittsburgh to launch the inaugural meeting of the Trade and Technology Council. One thing that came out of that initial TTC meeting was an agreement to work more closely on semiconductor supply chains. I think right before that meeting, the Europeans introduced their own bill that is sort of their equivalent of the CHIPS Act. I don't think that it's far enough along yet to have a euro amount on it, but please feel free to correct me if that's wrong. What tangible outcomes can we expect from that working group within the TTC, if any?
Great question. And it's still a little murky exactly where this is all going to go concretely, but we're very happy with these first steps. It needs to be much more collaboration when it comes to chip supply chains. I think at the very least, there needs to be more information sharing between governments and the private sector about identifying the vulnerabilities and gaps that need to be filled so that we're not wasting money and have duplicative results. Secondly, there's a lot of research that goes on in Europe on chips. IMEC in Brussels, CEA Leti in Grenoble, France, and part of the chips legislation has us doing something like that here in the U.S. And I think we can learn from each other on how to develop this thing called the National Semiconductor Technology Center here in the U.S. So there can be more collaboration and research. And then finally, actually, one more thing, export control. We absolutely need to have greater collaboration with like-minded countries on export control. Things can get very messed up if there's not collaboration. Unilateral export control essentially is no export control at all, usually. So, and then finally, something that's overlooked quite a lot is trade. If our trade flows are not working effectively, if there's high tariffs at borders, our supply chains don't work effectively. And Stephen told me you mentioned the Information Technology Agreement this morning. That agreement, which was just launched in 1997, threw a whole swath of tariffs for tech products down to zero, eliminated them across the world. Fantastic agreement, really helped propel enabling technology, technologies around the world. Was updated again in 2015 after 4 or 5 years of very painful negotiations, but successful negotiations. We need to expand this agreement one more time. The problem is WTO is struggling, and I think the U.S. and Europe can work together to bring that WTO back to greater relevance and start doing things like an environmental goods agreement that got halfway done last time, like expanding the information technology agreement again, like having an e-commerce agreement. So I think there's a lot of work that Europe and the U.S. can do in this regard.
Okay, thank you. I believe there's some audience questions. Carolina? Oh,
Please identify yourself.
we have to.
Would you like?
Okay, all right.
Thank you so much for the panelists for their speeches. And I remember that our speaker had talked about supply chain issues about Nutella in Italy, and he also said it's a global product. As someone who's been living in the US for 15 years, the main product that goes away quickly is toilet paper. Whenever a crisis happens, you can find. Yeah, okay, but it's a global product too. I just wanted to give an example. But yeah, and my question is, like, whoever wants to pick, the pandemic has delivered both supply and demand shocks to global supply chains. The pandemic highlighted outdated processes and introduced new customer trends, and many supply chains are likely to be forever changed, as we know. And risk managers need to assess their resilience against future shocks and adapt strategies. But biggest question is how, and if you would like to give some strategies, what should be done in terms of this resilience evaluations? Thank you.
It's a great question. I'm happy to take a stab at it, and I'm sure my colleagues will have their own views. I wanted to draw a distinction between resilience and reliability. Okay, it was something that I mentioned earlier in my remarks that Matt raised first thing this morning. I think government has very little impact on resilience because supply chains are executed and, for all intent and purposes, owned by the private sector. And so the private sector, in order to deal with uncertainties, will have to deal with resilience, which is the fortitude to keep a supply chain going, and its security to make sure that it is operating when it needs to under threatening conditions. How that gets executed is going to be within the domain of the private sector. Government, on the other hand, can take measures to increase the reliability of supply chains, to make sure that goods can get through a port, okay? That there aren't tariff barriers or restrictions being imposed on PPP or Nutella or whatever product you care about, toilet paper, okay? So I think it's really important to remember that the way things get to market is not a policy mandate. Policy mandates create direction and they create frameworks, but it's the private sector who is going to determine the execution of a supply chain, its reliability, for all intents and purposes, its reliability. Do they know who their suppliers are? And have they been able to qualify their suppliers in real time? Many suppliers were dramatically affected by the pandemic. They were not able to withstand the cash interruptions that the pandemic caused. That an owner of a supply chain needs to know your financial capability to weather the storm. And therefore, resilience and security are the day-to-day execution responsibilities of the private sector. Government can help on reliability as far as I'm concerned.
we did some research on how companies cope with supply risk of natural resources, and so all kind of minerals and metals. And one finding was that many of them simply don't know what's in their supply chain. So they buy a component. They have no idea what kind of material is inside or what kind of product has been needed in between in order to produce the components right now. So I think the very first thing is to identify which part of this of the components you buy is so important that you can't substitute it on a short period of time. And if it doesn't come, or just to a much higher price, where's the biggest economic consequence? So what's the most damaging element that or most the incident with the most potential damage. And then secondly, you should focus on that one and try to find out what's in the supply chain and what are the real risks in there. Because if you talk about transparency and look at, I don't know, chemical industry near to my office has hundreds of thousands of suppliers, tier 1. And then tier 2, it's multiple that. And even if you're a smaller company, you can't trace, at least right now, you can't trace all the supply chains that are relevant or that end in your factory. So you have to focus on the one or the two that are really critical for your business.
I'll just add one thing. We at CSIS recently concluded a study on supply chains and HVACs and transformers, which actually ended up being extremely interesting. Feel free to take a look. But we ended up talking with quite a bit of family-owned businesses, especially in the HVAC sector. And what we found is that they have a very good idea of their entire supply chain. They know where it's coming from. They know where they could possibly nearshore. They really have taken into account a lot of considerations that sometimes the government isn't able to get to on such a granular level. The other thing that really came out of all of our discussions with really under 10-person companies, very, very small, is that they are looking for reliability in government and global policy. They would like the government to play a fairly active role in making sure that supply chains themselves are reliable, but they also don't want to be surprised with new tariffs or turnaround policies or a 180 from the previous administration. And so I think they're really looking for reliability and continuity of existing policies, because it does take them time to identify new suppliers, new routes, new ways that they can nearshore. So I think that's something to take into account for those of us, especially based in Washington. I believe there are some more questions. Go ahead.
Well, thank you. While I was listening to you all...
Sorry, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Natalia from Libertad Desarrollo from Chile. There are many goals like sustainability, diversification, resilience. But at the same time, I think we have not really dealt with things that were prior to the pandemic challenges. Like, for example, countries that have fixed costs, high fixed costs of exporting, they would usually do fewer transactions, right? But at the same time, they would have to store what they are exporting, and storage costs are increase with the value that is of the product that is stored. So countries with high costs or fixed costs will also confront bureaucracy costs at the customs duties with malfunctioning norms or regulations. At the end of the day, if you sum up those two things, countries will end up exporting cheap goods, not very sophisticated goods, when they are in this scenario. High fixed costs, bureaucracy costs. So how can we take this challenge? Because at the same time, we're saying, let's diversify, let's ask for more sophisticated goods, let's ask for more responsibilities in terms of sustainability. But there are many developing countries that face really high costs and bureaucracy. There are studies that show that they could add up to a tax as 28%. And we're putting further responsibilities to those countries. Don't misread me. I agree with those responsibilities, but how can we take care with the technological advances or from a normative perspective from these bureaucracy challenges that will diminish at least in that part the costs?
Let me respond to how I see companies dealing with that kind of scenario, which is whether you're a B2B company or a B2C company, we see a huge movement into becoming a direct-to-consumer company. The distributor, the middleman, is increasingly becoming threatened by their blockage reality. And a lot of that, those intermediary steps are ones that get hooked up to the regulatory barriers that you're describing. So a lot of companies are saying, if I can hop over those intersection points with regulation or barriers, intentional or unintentional, I can reduce my costs, reduce my time, satisfy and have a more personal and engaged relationship with my customer and get the feedback from the customer directly and more quickly. So we see, the alcohol beverage industry is a classic case of a distribution business, a distribution industry, right, all around the world. Companies in that area are now going direct to consumer. It will be very interesting for countries like you've described. Are they willing to enable their winemaker to go direct to consumer in another country by reducing some of the regulatory barriers they want? Or are they going to remain wedded to the distribution model that is creating the time lag and the frustration on behalf of the consumer? So direct to consumer is one of the huge trends we see. And technology, of course, and process transformation is the infrastructure for that.
I have my questions about semiconductors. Philip Thompson from Americans for Tax Reform. USTR Catherine Chai said as she starts negotiations with China that market access isn't her main priority. Is there a concern there from the industry that by taking your eye off the ball there, that's ceding market to a lot of Chinese companies and the largest growing, fastest economy?
When it comes to China, our industry, for the most part, our problems with China are not market access problems. We have amazingly innovative technologies that the Chinese need. Our problems with China have more to do with NTBs, non-tariff barriers, IPR enforcement, tech transfer, things like that. So we need to have access to that market, and we do. More generally, though, market access is very important to us around the world, and we think that needs to be a priority. That's why I say we need to start doing things like working through the WTO to get some plurilateral agreements on the books. So some wins in that column. I think a lot of trends are going the other direction, and we need to try to reverse that. Thank you.
If I could just step in with an audience question from online. This is another hot topic in transatlantic affairs, which is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. The question from our audience member is, what impacts would such a tax have on global supply chains? Would one of the Europeans like to take that one?
That's a good, we could spend a day on that. The carbon border adjustment mechanism on the one hand side has the potential to set a similar price for carbon emissions. That's the idea for products in that case then sold, and it's the first idea is to focus it on some basic materials to products sold in Europe. That might make exports from other countries to Europe more expensive. It depends on how it will be designed in the end, has also an effect on on supply chains. So, for example, if aluminium from a company where or a country where renewable energies are available is cheaper than when it comes from a country which is where energy production or electricity production is based on coal, for example, then that makes a difference. And suddenly the environmental quality of the energy supply is a relevant factor in competition. So that's the import from the European perspective, the import part. The export side, there is will also have an influence on international markets, as the CBAM probably will not be effective for exports from Europe. So that means that European producers of steel, but also companies that, for example, use steel and produce tools or whatever, have to pay a higher price for steel than, because it's a high price including the carbon price, and then they have to export on that higher price level, and so that's a competitive disadvantage. Then it might also have then trade effects, and if other countries or producers suddenly are more competitiveness. So that can indeed change global supply chains. But I'm still not if that will really be an effective tool and be adopted in the end, or if it's more like like the stick you need to show sometimes in negotiations to get maybe to a solution which is which is also engaging. I'd like your comment early on. It's not only affecting third countries, but these countries should be engaged and could help, therefore, in discussions or agreements on global pricing of carbon.
Thank you. I think with the CBAM in general, the very, very short answer is that it depends. It depends on what good we're trading, how it's implemented. I think there are a lot of details left kind of in the gray area, not only in Brussels right now, but also on how the US chooses to respond or not respond. So I think we'll know a lot more about the implications of such a proposal as it materializes. I think we have time.
It has like one last sentence. It has huge potential for severe trade tensions, and if to put it mildly, and that of course then would have severe consequences on supply chains.
Okay, I think we have time for one more audience question, maybe two.
Raj Boya, a DC resident. Personally, I'm interested in reusing, repurposing, and recycling. I'm glad that you talked a lot about sustainability. So my question is related to environmental sustainability. With Internet of Things down the line in 10, 20 years, maybe a lot sooner, many electronic devices are going to be interconnected. So maybe billions of devices will be created in the next 10, 20 years. Rare earth elements, recycling, upcycling, and modular design and repairability. In the context of this, I mean, in general, any product, but let me focus on electronic components. I have been using this iPhone for 7 years. I hope to use it for 3 more years. I don't know whether Apple will let me do that. So is it environmentally sustainable? Because, for example, when I was in India some time ago, I could not recycle an electronic item. It was a huge challenge for me. I had to throw it out. I did not like it. So is there a nation, let's say in Europe or somewhere else, that is providing incentives or coming up with smart regulations that focus on recycling, upcycling, and modular design and repairability? Thank you.
To tell you honestly, I'm not an expert on this. I'm not focusing very much on these studies. But certainly it goes into the circular economy discussion. And there is a fight between the consumerism approach that you need to sell and, sell more products and make revenues out of big volumes. And on the other side, the fact that you want to impact less on the environment. But I don't know where we're going, but certainly if we look at product design in this case, products are more and more designed with the focus on becoming sustainable. So probably we will have products that will last more. But as we know from the semiconductor industry, the question is your phone as fast, as quick, as powerful as new generation phones? So probably, I think it's a balance. But if I may, and not to skip your question, but as I said, I have a limited knowledge. And if I may, going back to but the lady has left, probably she went to take some toilet paper. The question on toilet paper is interesting because here she's coming. We were talking about toilet paper. We're talking about no. The question about toilet paper is interesting, or the joke about toilet paper, because we're thinking about the supply chain, but we're forgetting one player in the supply chain that we have today. That is the consumer. Consumer is the last part of the supply chain because the consumer is using, for instance, toilet paper or Nutella, and is also recycling or is also need to reuse these products. So I would say the consumer pays part of the price of the supply chain, and the consumer could be the responsible driver of the supply chain. It's not just the policy that drives companies to be sustainable, it's also the consumer, sometimes ideologically driven, sometimes not. But Europe is working, for instance, on this in what you call the sustainability certification, and this will concern all products. I'm saying this to my American friends and semiconductor friends. Even the small device that will come to the European market in the next 10, 20 years will have a certificate or logo that says 100% sustainable or no deforestation. Europe is working on this. In the next 3-4 years, there will be a legislation, and the consumer will be part of this. You have apps that allow you to decide to monitor the visibility of the supply chain. So what is inside a product, where it comes from, and so that you can make your responsible decision. So I think that consumers are part of the supply chain.
I'll just add one quick thing about electronics recycling. I believe the Basel Convention on Hazardous Waste is currently home to the global agreement on hazardous electronics recycling. The US is not a signatory, but we're very involved in discussions, so I would guide you to that as a resource. We are at time. Thank you very much again to ITIF and GTIPA for hosting and our panelists for their thoughts. We will begin the next panel in, I believe, 4 minutes. And so if we could take a quick break and reconvene, that would be excellent. Thank you again for your time.
Thanks, Emily.